As land mammals, humans might have a terrestrial bias lurking in each one of us. Yet the underwater world composes most of the habitable parts of our planet. Coral reefs especially rank among the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. Through webcams on Explode.org, we can visit reefs every day of the year and visit with some of the fascinating animals who make reefs their home. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Fitz, the resident naturalist with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. And welcome back to Drawn to Explore, where we use art to deepen our understanding of the wildlife that we see on our cameras. And today we're combining art and observation to explore an underwater scene, which we haven't done yet. We've been focusing on the terrestrial realm that is up until now. And to guide us into our underwater environment is a person who has diving experience, snorkeling experience, and lives near the ocean right now, unlike me. My co-host, Sara Wolman. Sara, how are you doing? And what are we going to focus on?
Doing great. I'm really excited about our topic today because, as you said, I live right by the ocean and I go in it almost every day. So today we're going to be using paint pens to depict a parrotfish, which I see almost every time I'm out in the ocean, and its general surroundings. And I'll kind of explain about this reference photo a little bit later because we're kind of using a combination of images here. And so these paint pens that we're going to be using are really great tools for capturing kind of the bold colors that you're seeing in this photo, and the different textures that we see in the coral and how light really refracts in different areas of this composition that we're going to be doing today.
And if you want to follow along at home or share a sketch after we're done, this video will be recorded and available for you to rewatch. And you can always share that with us using the hashtag Drawn to Explore on social media. Or if you want to just email it directly to us, you can do that at feedback@explore.org. We're always looking forward to seeing what you have done with your artwork. And if you're watching this on explore.org right now, look for the reference photo in the comments. I pinned it to the top of the comments on our live chat channel on explore.org. If you are on YouTube, please ask the chat moderators there for a link to the photo. And before we begin sketching, let's get inspired by observing some footage from a coral reef at Utila Island in Honduras, which is brought to us by our webcam partner, Utopia Village. And we're looking specifically today, our featured species is the stoplight parrotfish. And here's one grazing next to a spotted trunkfish. Parrotfish are really fascinating animals. And notice how the parrotfish really has vivid scales and it has a unique shape to its beak-like mouth. The stoplight parrotfish is a grazing fish in a sense. Their front teeth are adapted to gouging algae off of coral. They have plate-like teeth located in the back of their throat that are used to crush corals that are ingested as the fish feeds. So that's kind of just a byproduct of their feeding style. They're not really going after the coral shells themselves, or the coral skeletons, that is, but they're ingesting a lot of it along the way. And our reference photo today is an individual in intermediate color phase, like you see in this clip right here. So this is defined by the fish's mottled brown and white scales towards its dorsal side, and then the red wash on its underside. Both males and females can have this color phase. But parrotfish are really interesting in another way is that they have different color phases across the world. Different species can look different depending on how old they are and their sexes. And this initially confused biologists as to the number of species of parrotfish. For example, the terminal phase males, which you see right here of the stoplight parrotfish, they look quite different. Terminal phase males are green with orange bands on the upper half of the head, and they have a large yellow spot on the tail. And then they also have a pretty prominent yellow spot right at the base of their gill plate. And this species also has the ability to change sexes too, depending on the population densities. So a terminal phase male was born female, as I understand it. And then one final tidbit of biology about parrotfish. You saw a little hint of that in this clip right here. They are a primary source of white sand in places where they inhabit. So if you're watching at home, maybe if you've been to a white sand beach, maybe in Central America or Hawaii or elsewhere, and you thought, well, I just love this white sand. It is just so pretty, right? I mean, we probably all thought that along when we've been to these places. Well, much of that sand is parrotfish poop. Parrotfish, again, they feed on algae, but they also ingest a lot of indigestible coral skeleton while they feed. So eventually they seed reef areas with crushed sand poop. It is beautiful, but it's also part poop at the same time. So you can think about that next time you have that sand, squishing between your toes when you're on these white sand beaches. The parrotfish, they're fascinating critters, live in a fascinating and varied environment. And the colors, they can key us into their age and reproductive status. I think, Sarah, you and I both learned a lot more about parrotfish just by kind of investigating their lives in preparation for our artwork today. But the water influences how we perceive fish underwater. So maybe you could talk about how the light that's cast through the underwater world is filtered by the water, and how might that affect how we approach sketching like a fish?
Definitely. And you can even see from these different clips that we've been showing how vastly different the lighting and colors of the water just change. And I notice this quite a bit even when I'm diving, depending on where I'm at and if I'm like filming or something like that. I need to put certain filters on my camera itself to be able to achieve the color that I want here. Because the water really distorts light and affects the colors of fish, coral, anything that you're seeing there. And it does it pretty quickly too. So that's why if anyone has been snorkeling and they're looking down and it seems like it's almost kind of a washed out blue, but if you dove down and went a lot closer to it, the colors start to come back and appear again. So it really does affect it. And that's why I thought it would be a really interesting play on color theory and looking at how the color and shading in our artwork really is affected by the lighting and how deep we are. Luckily, the channel that the reference photo from the channel that we're using isn't that deep, so we can have pretty good visibility to be able to utilize the proper colors. But it's a cool practice and something that I really started to get into in the past couple of years since I've really been diving a lot more. So now that we've kind of gotten a closer look at all these cool critters floating around, we can start gathering our materials and think about what we're going to do today. So for today's project, we're going to need a mixed media paper, very similar to Bristol paper. And you can just go to any art store and get that. Paint pens, variety of colors are the ones that you kind of shake up. You can kind of see in this video here, I'm doing some blending techniques. Paint pens are interesting because they do require a little bit of work and a little bit of patience. So you have to shake them up really, really hard and then kind of like blot them pretty frequently on a piece of paper to be able to get the ink to go all the way down to the pen tip here. And that's really important. You also have to kind of frequently clean off the tip too. Kind of how we learned that, like when we were doing pastels, it's very similar here. You don't want it to be muddied. You can see here I'm doing a variety of different blending techniques, and some are more successful than others. So you can use wet paint pen on wet paint pen, but it's a little bit more difficult. It's a lot more easy if you allow it to dry in between. And another thing that I haven't really, that I didn't really bring up in the materials is that a hair dryer is really great if you want to just get the job done quickly. So if you're kind of in the middle of that, it's not quite as bad. I would never recommend using a hair dryer for something like watercolor, but for paint pen, it doesn't run as much and it just gets it done a lot quicker. And then, we have our pencil to sketch the initial sketch too. I always use a darker lead, but I don't always recommend that for everyone. I just tend to work that way. And then our reference image is actually interesting today because this is something I have to actually do pretty frequently, is that combine images to get the actual image I want. A lot of snapshots that I was looking at of this underwater scene had awesome parrotfish in it, but they weren't quite in focus. And for something like this, where we are teaching how the different aspects of parrotfish biology, I wanted a little bit more of a detailed photo. So I took an image of a parrotfish and then did an overlay of it onto an image of the channel in Utila Island. And it's essentially the same thing. It just gives you a little bit more direction and pop in our composition. And this is very common, especially for someone like me that has to often draw like animal behavior or a very specific scene that we're not exactly seeing. Like I remember one time I was tasked with drawing what a bear looked like hibernating, and there's not a lot out there. So you have to really combine a lot of images to get the image that you want. And so that's what I did here today. And I believe I also have like the original references for both of them too, but this is the reference that we're going to use today. All right, so I kind of brought this up a little bit before, but for those new to paint pens, as we start, there's some tips. Again, shaking it really, really well. I almost recommend 30 seconds to a minute, especially with a new paint pen, because you really need to mix up that paint in there because it does separate sometimes. So that's what I would do here. We can go through this again and look at it, but if you just shake it up, and kind of dab on there, that's really your best bet for this here. And then it's a really light pressure to prevent ink from pooling. And I messed that up too at first when I first started using paint pen because I have a very heavy hand when I am drawing, as you can kind of see with some of my style I've done before. A lot of my stuff tends to come out really dark, and it's because I'm pressing really hard. And I don't really recommend that for paint pens. You don't need it. The pen is already flowing. So you just really need to get that tip saturated there, and then you lightly press it. You're not really just like pushing it down because if it will ruin the tip of the paint pen, it can also start making the paper itself pill up a little bit, and then it gets kind of stuck in everything, and you have to pick it out, and then you get frustrated. Not speaking from experience, of course.
Does it tend to pool up too? If
It can, yeah, it
Okay.
can. And so that's fine. And that's why I recommend like when you are actually using paint pen, you have scrap paper on the side so that you kind of dab it first before you go in. I use the same technique for almost any sort of like wet medium. So even with paint, anything like that, I have some sort of like scrap paper on the side that I'm kind of like dabbing and seeing where the viscosity is with the tool that I'm using, and it gives me a better idea. Now, that being said, I've made plenty of mistakes where I have pooled paint up. You can blot it if you wanted to with paint pen. If you let it dry, you can even scrape it with like a straight edge razor or something like that. And also with paint pens, really opaque, so you can always paint over it. Very similar if you're thinking about how we used like pastels. It can be very similar sort of technique depending on how pigmented your paint pen is. All right, so we kind of covered the basics here, so we can start sketching our underwater scene. Okay. So as you can see here, we've got more than just a singular animal here. We're working with a landscape, a seascape, if you will. Sorry, not land, sea. So I wanted to get the perspective of that first. So when we were looking at the reference photo, there's a horizon line, which is what I try to get down initially, because that kind of sets the scene for where I'm going to place everything else. And it always looks a little bit abstract at first, but really these are just guidelines to be able for us to have a correct perspective, to really give that sense of depth. Because when we're looking at that reference photo, we can tell that there's distance there. And so you have to ask yourself, how can I tell that? Like, why am I able to understand that that back part of the channel is considerably further away than where I am at the beginning? And there's a few things here. One, you can see kind of the angle of which the coral in the back is going. We have a foreground here too, which is really interesting. Also provides us depth. And then you can also see how the colors change as they go back. And that's something that we were just talking about, is that the further away you go, the more like washout blues and greens it becomes. And that's the same for depth. Things that look red will start looking almost like a green or a yellow the further away you get from it. And that's just the way the light is refracting. And that's what I find underwater scenes to be so fascinating, because it just completely changes how color theory works when you're on land. And so that's just more of what I'm doing here, is doing more of the perspective. And I'm kind of just really making these abstract shapes. I'm not trying to get too into the weeds here, which is something I tend to do sometimes and focus on that. I just want specific guiding points. And that's when I'm starting to draw my parrotfish. So I laid the scene down, and those gives me reference points as where I want to put my fish. And since it's a very prominent in our face sort of part of this composition, I want to make sure that it sticks out and that it is in proper proportion. And again, I obviously use an eraser pretty frequently. Yeah, and I really like using these kind of darker pencils, so that is just what happens. But for me, I find that the softer lead flows really well, and that helps me in my artistic practice. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. You can use a lighter colored lead if that suits you better. So I'm just taking the time here to kind of plot this out. And so we've really been building on the past couple of classes that we've had here. I am still using some basic shapes here. Obviously, this is a quite sped up video, but you can always go back and rewatch and see where I'm putting some of these bigger shapes. More of an oval for the body itself. And then I slowly start to adjust it here and there as I'm moving where things are in relation to each other so that I get the correct perspective on it. And that's what I'm doing here with the fins here. So that is what I find to be one of the most like telltale things if you're really trying to like portray a species super well, or the fin placement and then the coloration and scales. So I take a lot of time doing that because I find that's just for me. I think it's very helpful in IDing, especially with fish, because fish can be really tricky, especially where I live, where there's just a plethora of species. So some of them can look pretty similar. So I find this to be pretty helpful with that. And I'm, again, just using as I'm moving this, like if I am putting the fin here and I'm happy with the fin there, then I can really start to see like where the gill plate would be and where the like, pectoral fin will be. And then the fun thing about this parrotfish in particular is that it does have such prominent scale shapes in it. And that is something, although it can be tedious at times, it's the reward is very worth it at the end. But so as you can see there, I was putting lines horizontally across the fish to kind of place where I'm going to put each separate shape of the scale. And yeah, I am going to go in and actually draw every single one of those because I do think it makes a big difference. And I just love the patterns of a parrotfish, and that's one of the reasons why I chose this as something for us to do today, because I just think they're fascinating. I see them almost every time I go out and snorkel or dive. And they always catch my eye. So that's why I took the extra time to really put where the markings are.
Well, I
Um,
was wondering about the scales in particular because that's a detail that I can see myself getting lost in and
oh
getting
yeah.
frustrated with. So how did you keep from getting, overwhelmed with detail
And I do get
with those?
overwhelmed sometimes.
Yeah.
And I do it's almost like I know it's going to be hard, but at the end, I'm always super happy with it. And I do this both with fish scales and with bird feathers
Okay.
because they're incredibly detailed. But I will always say, because of those two reasons, I would say birds and fish are probably one of my top things that I love drawing. Bears too. Don't worry, guys. But birds and fish have just this layer of detail that it almost becomes like a meditative process for me. I can see how it can be long, it can be daunting. Because even when I started doing this, I was like, I can't believe I did this to myself again. Here we go. But as you do I think it really gives you a good sense of satisfaction when you're doing it. And again, you don't have to be like, oh, like there's exactly 52 scales here, so I have to make sure there's exactly 52 scales. It's more about getting the idea of the animal in the most correct way that works. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the fact that like, oh, this one scale doesn't match perfectly. You can even see in my drawing as we progress today that that's not the case. But the details like this, especially for this one, because they're so prominent and they really stick out and there's a high contrast, I think it's important to put it in there. And it becomes fun. And you'll even see as we go on and we start to get to that point, like you're like, okay, like I could see how actually doing these very simple shapes and just applying a kind of a black contrast on it actually isn't too bad. It's not as daunting as you think it is.
And then the coral too, you sketched that sort of in an abstract way. So were you thinking about simplifying the coral in maybe a similar manner?
100%. And I had to kind of make that executive decision when I was choosing this because you can get very hung up on that. And I am one of the first people to say that, that it's really easy to get hung up on the super tiny details because you get sucked into something that you're working on and it can get overwhelming. But for something like this, where I wanted to incorporate the ecosystem as well as the animal, I wanted to make the animal a little bit more prominent. So I was willing to put more detail into that and then kind of abstract the coral and sponges a bit more because even in itself, if you spend time looking at coral or diving, they are very abstract, interesting shapes. So it's actually pretty forgiving to be able to just kind of do like splotches of paint and stuff that you'll see we'll be doing later, and you can still recognize what it is.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's sort of like drawing trees in a sense.
very
Like
much.
there's more than one way to draw a tree, Like it, because when you look at them, they all have very different silhouettes to them. So like I wouldn't approach a conifer like I would a like a maple or something like that. So I think it with
100%.
coral, you can maybe use a similar approach.
Yeah, they're almost like the trees underwater. Very similar to that. Okay, well now we can start actually adding some color, which is the fun part in my opinion. And this is when we're really starting to use the paint pens. I cleaned up my blotchy sketch that I did beforehand, so I didn't put that on camera, but I did erase all the smudges because sometimes the graphite, especially the graphite I use, which is why I don't always recommend using the soft graphite, because it's so smudgy, paint can kind of pick that up sometimes and it gets mixed into your pigment. So again, to each their own, it's everyone's own artistic journey.
Hmm.
But yeah, so I wanted to look at, when I was looking at the photo, you have to kind of take your time because in your head, you're like, okay, that is just one singular color of blue in the background. And this is where it's helpful to start training your eye to see where this really minimum gradients are. So that's what I started to look for. And because I spend a lot of time in the water and I look at a lot of these photos all the time, even in the photos behind you and I, Mike, you can see towards the bottom, it's much darker than towards the top. And that's just how the sun is coming in and reflecting, and
Mhm.
also just how our field of vision works. So there is a very slight gradient. It's not as prominent in the reference photo that we're using, but there is one. And that's going to really, the little details like that really help with giving you that sense of depth. So I did my dark color first, and I was kind of experimenting here. I didn't really know where this was going to go. I only had about like, I think 5 or 6 different types of paint pens on me. So I was like, all right, we're not going to go for like a super photorealistic. We are going to use this as a challenge to try and get the point across with the most minimum amount of tools that I have, which we often find ourselves in that situation when we're doing art. And it's a fun challenge for me. It's creative. So I started putting the dark color down first, and then I put that lighter blue at the top. And then I wanted to see what that would look like just with, strong lines going across that to kind of mimic what the surface would look like. And obviously I took a little bit of creative license with this because it was an experiment. I wanted to see what this would look like. I hadn't drawn an underwater scene with paint pens in a very long time. So I just took my own advice and was like, all right, we're going to trust the process and we're going to keep going here. But that's what I was starting to look at. And I've drawn a lot of underwater scenes, but not particularly in this medium. And so that's why it was pretty fun to try and figure out how the light was going to refract. And you can always go back in and rework it. Like I said, when they do dry, it becomes really opaque and easy to just like take your paint pen and go right over it. And then I moved on here to the coral, which was starting to trip me up when I was doing it at first, because I was just like, how do I get these shapes across in a way that's both abstract but also tells you what it is? And so the more I stared at this photo, the more I realized like how high contrast it actually is. There's a lot of dark hidden corners within this coral. Obviously creates great habitat for a lot of the fish that live there. And so that's what I focused on first. So I took my black paint pen and I went in there and I just started trying to mark where the shapes were, where the shadows were. And we've done this a bit more with when we're actually drawing like a bear or something. We're always looking for where the dark shadows are and that really helps us place where the highlights are going to be. And so that's what I did first as I went in and really put in that dark contrast there. And then I was really trying to take a look and see what different colors are there. It's easy to be like, oh, well, that's probably just a bunch of green. And there's really just a ton of different colors. And a lot of it's an illusion. Like it almost looks green, but if you look a little closer, you're realizing that the color of the water is playing tricks on your eyes again. Which is what was so fascinating about this particular composition is that foreground coral that we're seeing is that kind of bright red color, very different than from the coral in the background there. And that is a great example of the light refraction that we're constantly seeing underwater. So I'm really taking the time here to try and put in detail, but not going too crazy. So I didn't have many like fine-tipped paint markers. I was using pretty thick ones. So that's where you really have to kind of play with, okay, this is as big as that or as small as this tip is going to get on here. So what sort of detail can I get away with something that's a little bit thicker than what I would normally use? And that's again when it's really nice to have that scrap paper on the side to do that. I'm really looking in on the top, on the left part of the reference photo, there just seems like a sea of crazy amount of detail and coral in there. And that's where it's really helpful to take a step back and not get too hung up on that. Look at where the big color blocks swatches are and look at where the highlights and the shadows are. That's really going to guide you the most. And that's kind of what I did. And I reworked this quite a bit and went in and out pretty frequently. And it took me a minute to get it, but I actually had a lot of fun figuring it out too. And it is kind of what it looks like underneath the water. It's just like very chaotic and beautiful. And there's a lot of different detail and stuff going on. And it just changes so incredibly, like depending on where you are and how you're looking at the coral.
And did you work the blend at any point during that specific process? And if you're blending, maybe it's probably really worthwhile to do it on a scrap piece of paper first to test it out and see
It definitely is. You know,
how
I
it
wasn't
flows.
blending too much. I opted for using kind of the like layered approach on this. Because there was so much detail in this, I wanted to make sure that there was still texture in there. And if I was blending too much in here, it would kind of just become like a muddled pu puddle on there. So I wanted to make sure that the texture was still like accurately portrayed enough to be able to capture that. But you know, it takes time and it takes a little bit of like, okay, be fluid with the piece that you're working on. Don't be too rigid in it and allow yourself a space for abstraction because so much of what we're even seeing in a lot of these underwater scenes is very abstract. You know, if you were to look at what a shape of a coral was, like out of context, you would just think it's a weird squiggle, you know? So embrace those weird squiggles and realize that that's like a natural part of the scene here. And that's what I had to keep telling myself too.
And did you ever, I don't know if you did it with this, but maybe with some other projects you've worked on, have you ever like zoomed in with a digital photo or an image to a point where you're kind of looking at pixels more because you're trying to pinpoint a color? Like, what is that really in the coral? Is it just like this brown haze, or
Yeah.
is there more detail there? Could
No,
that be a tool?
100%. I have done that pretty frequently. That's why if I am ever doing like a scientific illustration or something like that, I ask for it very specifically high resolution reference photos so that I can get that level of detail. And I find it especially useful for things like animals' eyes to really get in there because I think that again is another, I mean, I've said this before, how it really brings life to an animal. And same for something like this. And I've done illustrations and, you know, big scientific ones too, like murals and whatnot, where I have had to have that level of detail. And so, yeah, the zooming in is quite helpful for that. And it's actually really fascinating too. And I recommend doing that if you do have a nice camera and you're able to zoom in onto different like shapes that looks relatively abstract to just see how patterns really repeat themselves in nature. It's really fascinating. And I see that a lot with coral and with plants in general. Okay, so we got the back part in. We can try doing the foreground now, which was actually pretty tricky for me. Again, because I tend to get hung up on details here and getting like the accuracy of what things look like. And I had to go back through this quite a few times and was just like, why isn't this working? Oh, I should also mention I kind of skipped over it here too, but I kind of colored in the channel itself. And if you notice, it's not just this white sand that we are thinking of, like when we think of these tropical oceans, because again, of how the light is refracting off that sand, it had kind of that teal light blue color like towards the back there to kind of give it the shadow. And that's again where it takes time to just really study a picture and study the composition that you're working on. It really, really helps you not only be able to ID these animals super well and understand their behavior, but really understand like the color theory that is constantly applied and used when we're depicting these in an artistic medium. So I put that in and then I got to work on this foreground. And I thought the foreground was important here. I knew it was going to be a little challenging, but I thought it was important because we are really working with something where we're trying to portray depth here and give it a greater, more like 3D vision as much as we can here. And what I was mentioning before is like this foreground is very bright because we are super close to it. And it can kind of throw you off sometimes. But that's how a lot of, even with the fish too, it's very bright. And although I know I kind of Frankensteined this this reference photo here. It's what it looks like on the cams as well too. Like the fish in the foreground are very, very brightly colored. And it just gets a little bit more blue and washed out as it goes away. So I wanted to really look at the different colors in this foreground. And that's what was so fascinating to me and really stuck out to me. And it always does, especially even when I'm diving. The closer I get to the coral, the more my mind is blown by how beautiful and vibrant the colors are. And so I really took the time to look at this. And again, I didn't have all of the colors that I needed for this very particular coral. So I was like, how can I figure out how to do this in a way by using the colors that I have? And that's where you are using kind of like the layering techniques and almost make it kind of an optical color illusion. There's a lot of things like pointillism that does this, like some techniques you can look that. Sorry, that's Hefe in the background. He's very protective right now. But yes, so I wanted to make sure that I could still represent the colors that are in this photo, but just by using only like the six that I had. So I had that bright purple that you can see in there, and I just started kind of overlapping it to kind of give you the optical illusion of what these colors could look like, even though it's not the exact color. And yeah, I'm really spacing, which is crazy because I shouldn't be spacing on the name of this really famous artist that did this like big pointillism scenes, very famous, like at this looks like a nice picnic by a river. I can't believe I'm forgetting this. My art history teacher would be very sad, but that's basically like they're just using like two or three like primary colors, and depending on how you put them next to each other, when you stand away from something and the way the colors interact next to each other kind of fools your brain to thinking it's a different color. So
Oh,
that's
sure.
a really interesting way to kind of play on color theory, and to, if you don't have the colors that you want and you're not keen on mixing it, because I kind of opted for a different technique here to do that layering thing. I wanted to give that optical illusion of what these colors could look like with the colors that I had. It's kind of fun. It's really a really fun, almost like a science experiment, really, because you're tricking your brain a little bit. Not that I have figured out how to do this super well, but I can do it well enough. And anyone can. It's just really a matter of like putting colors together and seeing which combination makes your brain think it's a certain color. And that's what I did here to try and really bring the vibrancy out here. You can see my fun little pad there that I am constantly blotting on, which again, super important. And then I'm adding some highlights, which I really think are one of the more important things when finishing pieces like this, and not to overdo the highlights, but just a few here and there keeps the composition interesting, and it provides like accurate lighting. Everything has highlights, but sometimes it's just a very little part of it. But that very little like last stroke of whatever you're doing is really what brings the composition together.
And how I guess it maybe doesn't matter as much with the coral since they are sort of more abstract in their shape in a sense. But with the fish, how confident do you want to be in the shape of the fish at this stage? It seems like you want to have your outline set, but you've also said, I think more than once, that you can paint over something if it doesn't work
Yeah,
out with you.
it's all about kind of making your life a little bit easier, you know?
Okay.
So I try to pay attention to the dimensions of the fish. Like probably the thing that I really try and get correctly is the perspective of that. Because like going over that and redoing that is going to be harder than going over something that's a little bit more abstract like the coral. Like that leaves a lot of room for error with the coral, because you're like, okay, they're all just kind of a bunch of squiggly lines anyway. So if I have to go back in and redo them, that's not as bad. But with the fish itself, because I do want to portray a very particular species, I take a little bit of extra time to make sure that at least the proportions of the fish are correct. Because if the proportions are correct, then you can allow a little bit more leniency for abstractions in, say, like color. Because again, obviously, I don't have all of the colors that fish actually is. So I was taking a little bit of artistic liberty with that, but you're still able to identify the fish that it is because of the shape that I spent time on. Okay, we got the background in and foreground. That's the fun part. Just the fish itself. And I actually had a lot of fun doing this one because since I had already done the background, I was like feeling pretty loose at this point and pretty confident. So that's what was really fun about jumping into this. So again, I started with the darker color. Yeah, you don't really have to do that with paint pen because even white on a dark color is opaque enough. But for me, it was kind of more of a visual cue of like, all right, this is where I'm going to put its markings. And it has kind of that black background anyway, so I thought it was a good base to use. And it's kind of how I did the background and the foreground too, is I went and did that black paint first. And for me,
Yeah, I was wondering about that specifically when I watched this video before the program. Like, black is a dominant color on the fish, but it's not the only dominant color. Like I could see multiple routes here,
so
red or
many.
even like yellow or turquoise.
Definitely. Yeah, you could have done it that way too. I think for me, the contrast kind of helps my eye a little bit.
Okay.
But it's just how my brain works with it is that like, all right, it gives me like kind of a guide point of like how I want things to look, and allows me to like see it a little bit better. But yeah, there's tons of people that would do it a different way too. Like you could do that with like the red, it's really bright, but yeah, this kind of gives me the outline of it a little bit more. And then I can go in with the other colors and kind of like morph it if I need to. Again, another great part about having the paint pens is that you can just pretty much mess with them any way you want, so long as you let it dry in between. That is the key. I've made that mistake before. But yeah, so I went over it and just I didn't have a fine tip paint pen, so I had to really kind of like work the tip of my black paint pen a bit to get some of those like finer details. And I always freak out about the eye because I love doing the eyes the best. So I'd take a few steps back from that one before I like fully committed to doing the detail on that. But then decided to started with the color, and this is where it gets really fun for me. It's like when you can feel you're kind of like in the end of doing a composition and it's finally starting to come together. It's a journey. It really is. Because you can get these like levels of frustration. You got to take a minute, walk away, come back to it, and then it starts to work out. It's very much every single time I do this, it's very much a trust the process sort of situation. And I like to spend a lot of time on doing these like little highlights and colors here because I think this is what really starts to be like, all right, that's a parrotfish. That's a stoplight parrotfish. That might be a female stoplight
Mhm.
parrotfish. So that's when you start doing that, it starts to come together and you get kind of a more of a sense of like accomplishment, satisfaction when you're putting in these final touches here. And the color was fun for me because I kind of had to look at the subtleties of it. And I specifically chose this variation of a colored parrotfish because I like the bright red. We're all very used to seeing like the blue one, but I thought this kind of gave it more of an interesting story because, as you were saying, Mike, we kind of learned a bit about parrotfish in preparation for this show, and they're really fascinating. Their coloration is really really cool. So I when I was diving and I'd seen these before, I thought they were completely two different species. I had no idea that one was the male version, one was the female version. So now I know, and I'm fascinated by that. Yeah, and so that was really fun about coming in and kind of playing with these more vibrant colors. You could see in the photo that red is super vibrant. I didn't have a red that was quite like that. So this is where it's fun to layer colors. So I messed around with some yellow, some pink, and some orange to try and see if I could pump up the color, even if it was like a slightly like an optical illusion as much as I could. And that's where artistic license comes in, you know. So as long as you're getting the point across as best as you can, then go for it. And I do a lot of scientific based illustrations, so I have to very much like make sure that this is what it looks like. But when you're just doing this for fun, you can make that fish any color you want. There's no right or wrong way to do this. Like if you want to specifically have this and be like, this is this type of parrotfish, sure, use the colors that match it closely. But also realize that you don't have to get hung up on that stuff all the time. A lot of it's just like practicing. This is a sketch, you know. It's really just about becoming more comfortable with observing this animal, and it makes you have a connection with it, I think, a little bit closer too. So that's kind of the rule that I use when I'm doing these is I don't try and get too hung up on the details unless I'm specifically getting paid to get hung up on the details. It's kind of fun to get a little loose and see what your interpretation of the wildlife or scene in front of you is, because that's indicative of like your connection to of whatever it is that you're drawing. And yeah, here I am putting in a few more details. I still wasn't happy with that foreground part, but then it came with, yeah, then I finished it. It's quite the process. This one took me a lot longer than some of our other previous ones, but I actually, at the end, had a lot of fun doing it. I'm excited to do more of it too.
And you were working on the eye too, kind of periodically throughout,
Mhm.
but that's such an important element of it. It seems like there was some final detail that you waited to add until the very end. With some of our other sketches we've done, it seems like deciding how light is presented on the eye was really important. Was that as much of a decision in this, or
It
was it
was,
kind
and
of
clear this eye didn't have quite as much detail as some of the other pieces that we've worked on before, but because there is detail in there and it's tiny, it's really small. I had to wait for the base layer to dry, and then I would have to like kind of keep going back in and reworking as much as I could. And it was difficult too because again, my paint pens are kind of thick, so I had to like very carefully dab where I wanted a highlight to be there. And this is where I've had to learn a lot of patience. Is like, even though I want to finish just one part of it very clearly, I have to take a break. It forces me to take a step back because it has to dry, work on something else, and then come back around to it. And that I find is a good practice to have in general when you're creating a piece.
and then what I guess maybe what stood out to you about the parrotfish as you worked on this?
I think the scales were really fascinating to me. I mean, just how prominently they stand out. I really enjoyed that. I spend a lot of time in the ocean, so this is something I stare at pretty frequently. But they're moving. They don't want anything to do with me. So it was cool to be able to actually like look at it and look at the bone structure of the parrotfish. Again, like you had mentioned earlier, they do kind of have a very like unique sort of like shape to them. And it's really interesting seeing them swim super fast. They kind of become like this very sleek target looking thing versus when they're just kind of like hanging out and chilling and have all of their fins out. I just the general, I think, composition of the parrotfish made me stare at it a lot closer. And it was really neat to learn about the sexual dimorphism between the two of them, the male and the female. I really appreciated that. And I felt like I learned this is why I do this because you always learn so much about whatever it is that you're drawing. So that's the best part about doing like anything that's an artist naturalist sort of composition.
Yeah, it helps you see the details in things that maybe you would otherwise kind of pass you by. And just for me, learning about just doing a bit of reading about this species was fascinating for me, even though I'm not going to complete like a full, paint pen drawing with this. I was, while we were talking, I was just doing
Yeah.
a little bit of an outline. So
That's really
I,
good.
I got I got that far, at least while we were talking. One of the things though, Sarah, I want you to look for when you're out there. If you ever go diving like at night, look for
Yes.
them in their mucus cocoon. I don't know if this species does it, but
I
some of
don't
them have
know.
like a mucus cocoon
Oh,
that they
that's so
form
cool.
each day to protect themselves.
I will do this
Essentially,
for you,
they'll
Mike.
be like in a little cubby hole covered in like this mucus balloon or whatever. And
That's
that would be on my
fascinating.
bucket list to see if I was in
See, and
next
I
time I'm
just
in
learned that
Parrotfish
because I had no idea. So this is
Habitat.
the that's the best part of this. Yeah, I will do that and report back.
Well, there's if you want other examples of like coral reefs or underwater scenes, there's a ton of them in the galleries on explore.org. So just go there and browse and see what people have captured over time. Really beautiful scenes to check out. And parrotfish, they're vital to coral reef ecosystems. Their habitats, though, are facing threats from climate change and pollution. Coral ecosystems, in particular, are some of the most endangered ecosystems on the planet. And we're at risk of losing them all, essentially, by the end of this century if we don't get our act together. So hopefully we can learn to appreciate them just a little bit more through art, and then will inspire us step by step to take more action to protect and appreciate these ecosystems. And I want to thank everybody for joining us again for this episode of Drawn to Explore. Our next episode will be after the new year, so sometime in January, Sarah. We don't have it scheduled yet, but we have some ideas about
Hmm.
what we might focus on.
We're doing birds. We're gonna do birds. We're probably gonna do a series of that with birds and interesting formations. Using pen and ink, maybe some paint pen again too. But we're gonna switch it up a little bit.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah, for guiding us along on this task and journey today. So my co-host was Sara Wolman, a graphic designer and social media curator for explore.org. Keep sketching, keep painting, keep observing the world around you. As with all of our live events, a replay of this live chat will be available on YouTube to rewatch anytime you want. Share your sketches through Drawn to Explore and join us next time. My name is Mike Fitz with explore.org. Thanks for joining us today. And as we like to say here at Explore, never stop learning.